The chamber had no windows. That was the first thing every new ambassador noticed. The Galactic Conclave's Grand Assembly Hall sat at the center of Station Aethon, buried under 6 layers of reinforced hull, insulated from starlight, from radiation, from anything that might remind those inside that space was vast and indifferent and did not care about their proceedings. The architects had intended it to feel important, permanent, like the decisions made inside it were as fixed as gravity. Ambassador Yara Osei had been inside this room 41 times. She had never once felt like the walls were on her side. She sat at the human delegation table, a long crescent of pale alloy, third from the left, positioned exactly where the Conclave's seating charter had always placed Earth's representative. Not at the center. Never at the center. Close enough to suggest inclusion. Far enough to remind everyone it was conditional. The chamber was full. All 12 primary species had sent their senior ambassadors. Galleries above held observers, aides, press attachés. The Vorith delegation sat directly across from her, 4 of them, tall and narrow-shouldered, their bioluminescent markings cycling through calm blues. They had called for this session. They had also written the resolution being voted on today, though they'd had the courtesy to run it through a Keth intermediary so it wouldn't look personal. It was absolutely personal. High Arbiter Son, a Moravian, ancient enough that his skin had calcified into something resembling pale stone, called the Session to order. The resolution was read aloud by a conclave clerk in the standard 6 languages. Yara listened to all 6 versions. The wording shifted slightly between languages, the way it always did, but the meaning stayed the same in every one. Earth was to be exiled from the Galactic Conclave, effective upon ratification, binding for no less than 2 standard centuries, revocable only by unanimous revote of all 12 member species, a threshold so high it had never once been reached in the Conclave's history for any resolution, let alone a reversal of one. The grounds were listed: destabilizing commercial practices, refusal to submit human-developed technologies to Conclave, licensing review, cultural interference, repeated violations of the Non-Assimilation Compact, a charge so vague it could mean anything, and had been used to mean anything, for years. There was also a line about human psychological volatility in diplomatic contexts, which Yara suspected was specifically about the time she had laughed during a Vorith funeral oration. She had not known it was a funeral oration. The Vorith had never quite forgiven her. The clerk finished reading. High Arbiter Son asked if the human delegation wished to make a statement before the vote. Yara stood. The room watched her. Some with the careful blankness of species who had learned to hide what they felt around humans. Some with open curiosity. The Vorith-led ambassador, Sereth Ka, watched her the way a person watches a fire they have just lit, with the particular attention of someone waiting to see how far it spreads. Yara looked at the resolution text on her table. She had read it 4 times on the transport here. She had made notes in the margins in the small, cramped handwriting she'd had since she was 12 years old, sitting in a classroom in Accra while her teacher explained that the world was much larger than what you could see from a window. She looked up. "We've been members of this conclave for 63 years, she said. Her voice was even, not loud. The room's acoustics were good enough that she didn't need to be. We've contributed to 9 of the 17 infrastructure expansions completed in that period. We staff 4 of the 6 cross-species medical research stations. Our commercial logistics networks handle, by the Conclave's own last audit, approximately 31% of non-military cargo transit in the inner systems." She paused. "I mention these things not to argue against the resolution. I mention them so that the record is complete." Sereth Ka shifted slightly. The bioluminescence on his neck flickered yellow for a fraction of a second. "We understand the vote," Yara said. "We understand what it means. We simply want it understood clearly, on record, before the vote is cast, that we are not surprised." She sat down. San called the vote. It went around the chamber in order of founding membership. 1 by 1. 12 species, 12 votes. The Vorith voted first yes. Of course. The Keth voted yes, as she had expected, their ambassador not meeting her eyes. The Muir voted yes. The Pell voted yes. The Drassic abstained. which was the closest thing to a no that the Drassic ever managed in any vote involving the Vorith. The remaining 7 voted yes. 12 votes cast, 10 in favor, 1 abstention, 1 absence. The Thun delegation, who had not sent a representative today, which Yara had also noted. The resolution passed. High Arbiter San formally announced it in all 6 languages. The clerk began processing the ratification paperwork. The galleries above were buzzing the sound of 100 aides opening communicators, preparing dispatches, beginning the transmission that would carry today's result to every corner of Conclave space. San looked at the human table. His stone-pale face was unreadable in the way that very old faces sometimes were. Too many expressions had passed across it to leave room for any single one. Ambassador Ose, does the human delegation have a formal response to the ratification? Yara stood again. She looked around the room. The Vorith table, the Keth. The pale overhead lights that hummed at a frequency humans found slightly irritating but that no one had ever adjusted in 63 years of human membership. Because it had never been human comfort, the room was designed for. We accept, she said. Effective immediately. She picked up the small case she'd brought with her. The one that held nothing important, just her personal tablet, a thermos of cold coffee, and the notes she'd made on the resolution with their cramped margins. She tucked it under her arm. Good luck, she said. She walked out. Not fast. Not slow. The walk of someone who knows exactly how long a corridor is and has no particular feeling about it either way. Behind her, the chamber did not erupt. It did not fall into chaos. It went very quiet, the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it hears a sound they almost recognize and can't quite place. Sareth Ka watched the door close behind her. His bioluminescence had gone a color his aides had never seen on him before. Not yellow, not blue, something between them. Outside, in the corridor, Yara Ose walked toward the docking bay where the human transport was waiting. She did not look back. She pulled out her communicator and sent a single message, 6 words, pre-written, to a distribution list of 412 human department heads, logistics directors, medical chiefs, and infrastructure managers currently stationed across Conclave space. The message said, "It passed. You know what to do." She put the communicator away. She had a long flight home. She used it to sleep. The first resignation came in at 03:00 station time. Dr. Amara Voss, Chief of Cross-Species Medicine at Conclave Station Merith, submitted her notice via the standard staff portal, effective in 30 days, as her contract required. No reason given beyond personal reassignment. Her supervisor, a Keth administrator named Ubarath, flagged it automatically and went back to sleep, because individual staff departures were not his concern at 03:00. By 06:00, there were 41 more. By noon, there were 217. They came from every station, every post, every quiet corner of Conclave infrastructure where humans had settled into jobs that no one else had wanted or thought to want. Maintenance engineers, atmospheric calibration technicians, data archivists, port logistics coordinators, xenobiological translators, a specialty that required not just language fluency but the particular kind of patient, irrational stubbornness that made a person willing to spend 8 years learning the 37 tonal registers of Vorith formal speech, just to be useful in rooms where no one thanked you for it. All of them filing notices. All of them correct to the letter of their contracts. On Station Athon itself, the human diplomatic and administrative staff had already begun. Not with drama. With boxes. Flat, standard-issue moving containers, the same kind used for any routine relocation. They moved through corridors with the quiet efficiency of people who had been told once and did not need to be told again. Personal items. Work terminals, the ones registered to human personnel, which could not be retained under Conclave property law without a renegotiated asset agreement, which no one had filed. Files transferred to personal storage drives. Keys physical and digital left on desks, in sealed envelopes, addressed to the relevant department heads. Sareth Ka received a report about it by mid-afternoon. He read it twice. Then he called his senior aide, a young Vorith named Urath Sel, into his office. "They're leaving," Urath Sel said. He was young enough that he said it with the slight surprise of someone still calibrating how literally humans meant things. "I can read?" Sirith Ka said. "Should we contact the Conclave legal office? Find out if there is any provision in the Exile decree that requires them to maintain a transition period for critical infrastructure roles." Urathsel was quiet for a moment. "I don't believe there is. Find out." There was not. The Exile decree had been written to remove humans from Conclave membership and space. It had not been written with any particular attention to what would happen in the time between the vote and the departure, because the assumption, unspoken, unarticulated, the kind of assumption that lives in the walls of a room had been that humans would fight it, would petition, would send counter-resolutions, and demand arbitration, and generally make themselves difficult in the way they always had, which would give the Conclave time to manage the transition at its own pace. The assumption had been wrong. Human commercial firms began processing contract terminations within 48 hours. Not all of them, the contracts that ran longer, had clauses, timelines, obligations that could not be walked away from without penalty. But every short-term contract, every month-to-month service agreement, every rolling logistics arrangement that had been renewed so many times it had become invisible, those ended. Quietly. Correctly. With full documentation filed through Conclave Commercial Registry, freight routes were the first thing people noticed. Not because the routes stopped immediately, they didn't. The 90-day notice period meant cargo was still moving. For now. But booking queues that had always been managed by human logistics firms stopped accepting new orders. And the species who had always booked through those firms, who had never really thought about who was running the queue, only that the queue worked, found themselves looking at systems they had never had to navigate directly before. The Moore Commercial Authority sent an inquiry to 3 separate human logistics firms in 1 week. All 3 responses were identical in their courtesy and identical in their finality. Contracts currently in progress would be honored. No new contracts would be accepted. On Station Merith, Uberith had stopped sleeping well. He had not fully understood, before the resignations began, how many humans were on his station. Not because he had been careless, he maintained staffing records, reviewed them quarterly, knew the numbers. But numbers on a page and the daily reality of a station running smoothly were 2 different things. He had known the number of human medical staff. He had not known, in the way you know a thing when it is suddenly gone, that the human staff were the ones who ran the night shift. Every night, without exception. Because they had volunteered for it, years ago, citing something about circadian adaptability, and no one else had objected, and it had simply become the way things were. The night shift, now, was understaffed. Not critically, not yet. The Conclave Emergency Coordination Office opened a file on the situation at the end of the first week. They labeled it low priority. This was because the situation, at the end of the first week, was not yet an emergency. It was only the feeling of something important being about to become one. The humans continued to leave. Not all at once. Not with noise. In groups, in pairs, individually, on transports that departed on schedule from stations they had served on for years. Some of them had colleagues who came to see them off. Some of those colleagues brought small gifts, the way you do when someone leaves, and you are not quite sure if you will see them again. Some said things like, "Surely it will be sorted out soon." The humans smiled and said polite things back and carried their boxes onto their ships. At one of the relay stations in the mid-belt station Vorith, 4, named for the species that had funded its construction, a human engineering team completed its final maintenance cycle 6 hours before their departure. They left the station in perfect condition. Every system green. Every diagnostic logged. Every repair notation filed in the station's maintenance record, clearly labeled, with the relevant technical manual pages cited in case whoever came next needed guidance. The station supervisor, Avorith, of course, reviewed the logs after they left. Everything was in order. Impeccable, even. He had a strange feeling he could not name. It was not gratitude exactly. It was more specific than that. It was the feeling of watching someone pack up their work with perfect care and walk away. And understanding, only in the walking away, that you had never really understood what the work was. He sent a report to Sirith Ka's office. Standard format. Factual. The humans had completed their final maintenance cycle at Vorith, 4, and departed without incident. All 17 of his station's critical systems were operating normally. He did not know for how long. The first thing to fail was not dramatic. It was a routing update. Every 6 weeks, the Conclave's cargo transit network pushed an update to its central navigation tables, a dry, technical process that adjusted freight lanes based on traffic density, fuel depot availability, and minor gravitational drift in high-traffic corridors. The update had always run automatically. No one had ever thought to ask who maintained the algorithm behind it, because it had always simply worked. It did not work. Not catastrophically. Not in a way that stopped ships. The update ran, processed, and produced a set of lane adjustments that were technically within tolerance, but practically wrong, tightening a bottleneck near the Keth inner stations that added between 9 and 14 days to 17 of the comma. Most traveled trade routes. Freight operators filed complaints. The Conclave Technical Bureau opened a ticket. 2 junior analysts spent 3 days looking at the algorithm's architecture before one of them found a notation buried in the code's documentation. Maintained by Halverson Logistics Solutions. Human registered. Contract Ref. CTR 7741E. CTR 7741E. Had been a rolling annual contract. It had not been renewed. The Bureau escalated the ticket. They assigned a Keth software engineer to take over maintenance of the routing algorithm. She was talented and thorough, and it took her 11 weeks to fully understand a system the human team had apparently managed with 2 people and a shared calendar. She fixed the bottleneck. She also found 4 other places in the algorithm where similar drift had been silently corrected, on a regular schedule, for what the logs indicated was approximately 19 years. She filed a report. It was not the only one filed that month. The medical situation on the outer stations developed more slowly. In the first weeks after the withdrawal, it was barely visible. A slightly longer wait time for certain specialist consultations. Some treatment protocols that were technically current, but had not been updated with the most recent research, because the updating process had been informal, human-run, and was now nobody's formal job. Patients were treated. Nobody died from it. Not yet. What the station medical chiefs began noticing was narrower than that. Precision errors. Small ones. A dosage calibration for a PEL patient that was correct by the old standard and slightly wrong by a revised standard that had been published 3 months ago, a revision that the now-departed human medical team had known about and had been planning to integrate at their next quarterly review, which had never happened. The Muir patient who came in with a secondary infection that the diagnostic system flagged as a primary condition, not a critical mistake, caught in time. But the physician reviewing it noted something in his report. The diagnostic system's cross-species pathology index had a last update timestamp that was 18 months old. He had not known this before. He had not known to look. It was the kind of thing that, once you saw it, you could not stop seeing. The Conclave Emergency Coordination Office upgraded the situation file from low priority to moderate concern in the 6th week. This was a bureaucratic distinction that meant slightly more people were reading slightly more reports. It did not yet mean anyone had said the word humans out loud in an official meeting, because saying the word out loud in an official meeting would require acknowledging something that the Conclave's 12 senior ambassadors were not yet prepared to acknowledge. Then the Drassic-Pell border situation happened. It was not a war. It was barely a confrontation. The Drassic and the Pell had a territorial overlap in a system called Verith 9, a cold, resource-sparse system that neither species particularly wanted, but that both had historical claim to, which made it the kind of dispute that simmered for decades without boiling because there was a mechanism for managing it. The mechanism was the Neutral Arbitration Bureau. The Neutral Arbitration Bureau had been, for 22 years, staffed and administered by a human legal firm out of Station Coram. It had handled the Drassic-Pell overlap 5 times since its founding, twice formally, 3 times through quiet pre-arbitration negotiations that never required a full hearing. Everyone involved had understood that if anything escalated in Verith 9, you called the Bureau. You called it before you sent ships. That was simply how it worked. The Bureau was no longer in Conclave space. The firm had not dissolved. It had relocated, along with everything else human, to coordinates outside Conclave jurisdiction. Its communication systems still functioned, but they were no longer operating under Conclave commercial license, and the Drassic delegation choosing, in this moment, to interpret procedure very strictly filed that the Bureau no longer had standing to arbitrate under the Conclave territorial dispute framework. The Pell delegation said the Bureau absolutely had standing. A Conclave framework change needed a 12-species vote, and the Drassic were using a paperwork objection to buy time to reinforce their position in Verith 9. The Drassic said, if the Pell moved those ships, they would move theirs. 11 days. 3 emergency council sessions. 6 separate proposals for alternative arbitration, each rejected by one side or the other on procedural grounds. Ships moved. Not to attack, to position. The way you move pieces when you are not yet playing the game but want to make sure you are ready to. High Arbiter San sent a private message to Ambassador Sareth Ka. It said, "We need the arbitration matter resolved. What is the status of establishing replacement neutral parties?" Sareth Ka's reply took 6 hours. It said, "There are no established neutral parties with comparable cross-species legal expertise in Conclave space at this time. We are reviewing options." San read it. Read it again. He pulled up the Conclave's official directory of licensed commercial legal firms. The ones with full Conclave standing. The ones that had passed the certification process. The ones whose arbitration rulings were automatically recognized as binding under Conclave law. He filtered for firms with experience in territorial disputes. Then for firms with experience across more than 4 species. Then for firms currently operating within Conclave jurisdiction. 11 firms met the first criterion. 4 met the second. None met the third. He sat in his office under the permanent artificial light that the Merivian circadian system required, and he looked at the empty third column of the directory for a long time. He did not send a response to Sareth Ka. He opened a new document instead and began writing notes. Not an official report, personal ones, in the cramped notation style he had used since before some of the current ambassadors were born. He wrote down dates, numbers, the routing algorithm, the medical index timestamps, the arbitration gap. Small things. Added up. He did not write any conclusions. He did not need to. The conclusions were already in the room with him. They had been there since Yara Osei had picked up her case and walked out the door, and he simply had not had enough numbers yet to see them clearly. He had them now. Outside the station, in the shipping lanes near the Midbelt, a freighter running a Keth trade route passed through a corridor that had been maintained for 19 years by people who were no longer there. The lane was still open. The beacons still ran. The gravitational calculations were still correct for now, based on a drift model last updated 4 months ago. The freighter passed through without incident. It would for a while yet. A while was not the same as forever. The envoy was called the Reconciliation Mission. That was the official name, chosen by committee, approved by 8 of the 12 ambassadors after 2 weeks of argument about whether the word reconciliation implied that the conclave had done something wrong. It had been shortened, in internal communications, to the Rec Mission, which sounded less like an apology and more like a bureaucratic errand, which was how most of the ambassadors preferred to think of it. It was led by Ambassador Keth Primary Suinvel, a deliberate choice. The Keth were regarded as the most neutral of the founding species, their vote on the Exile having been, yes, but their public posture since then, having been carefully, professionally ambiguous. They were the right face for this particular door. Suinvel had brought 3 aides, a legal advisor, and a small case of what the Keth considered appropriate diplomatic gifts. She had also brought, at the insistence of Sareth Ka's office, a Vorith trade attaché named Orith Sen, who was there to observe, and who had been told, very clearly, not to speak unless spoken to. The coordinates in the summons, because that was what the Conclave's request had eventually been. A summons, dressed as an invitation, led them to a system called Solace 7. It was not listed in any Conclave stellar registry. It appeared in the records of the Independent Cartographic Union. a small, quiet organization that operated entirely outside Conclave jurisdiction and had been certifying star system claims for 300 years. Earth had registered Solus 7 with the ICU 14 years ago. Sunvel had read that detail in the mission briefing, and then read it again, and then set the briefing down, and looked at the wall of her transport cabin for a long moment before picking it up again. 14 years. 2 years before the first formal motion calling for Earth's review had even been filed. Long before anyone in the Conclave had been speaking seriously about Exile. Humans had been carrying out these plans long before the Conclave thought they were making the decision. She filed that information in the back of her mind. She would need it later. What they found at Solus 7 was not a refugee colony. The initial scan data had shown a human settlement, which Sunvel had assumed would look like a human settlement placed under pressure, functional, but strained, the kind of place built fast from necessity. What the scan data showed instead was a station 3 times the size of Station Aethon, a shipyard running at what the sensors estimated was near full capacity, an agricultural ring large enough to sustain a population significantly larger than current Conclave estimates for the human population of the outer territories, and a communications array that was, frankly, unsettling in its reach. They built all this in 3 months? Orath Sen said. Sunvel gave him the look she had been told to give him when he forgot himself. He went quiet. They had not built it in 3 months. That was clear. This had been under construction for years. This had been planned, funded, and quietly assembled while humans sat in Conclave meetings, and filed paperwork, and maintained routing algorithms, and staffed night shifts, and did all the things that kept the Conclave's daily reality intact and in the spaces. Between, they had been building this. The docking bay they were guided to was clean, large, and warm, in a way that Conclave stations rarely were. The lighting was different from station standard, slightly warmer in tone, calibrated for human eyes first and everyone else second, which was a reversal Sunvel noticed immediately. A human docking crew in plain gray uniforms guided the Keth transport in with the easy efficiency of people who did this every day. Ambassador Yara Osei met them at the bay door. She looked the same as she had in the chamber on Station Aethon. That was the first thing Sunvel noticed, and she wasn't sure why it surprised her. What had she expected? That 3 months of exile would have weathered her down. If anything, Osei looked less tired than she had at the Conclave. There was something in the way she stood that was not triumphant, but was something close to it, in the way that relaxing a clenched fist is close to triumph without being the same thing. Ambassador Sunvel, Osei said, "Thank you for coming, please." She gestured into the corridor. There was no Conclave insignia anywhere, no neutral diplomatic colors. The walls were plain, functional, marked with occasional Earth administrative notation in several human languages. A few maintenance workers passed them in the corridor and nodded to Osei and looked at the Keth delegation with mild curiosity and went back to their work. Sunvel had been on hundreds of diplomatic visits. She had developed a sense for the mood of a station within minutes of arrival, whether it was tense, whether it was performing calm over something worse. She felt none of that here. The station felt like a place where people were busy because they had a great deal of work to do and found the work worth doing. That was not the feeling of a people who had been punished. The meeting room had a long table, human-proportioned chairs, and a smaller set of secondary seating along one wall for the Keth aides. There were no Conclave flags, no neutral colors. There was a window, an actual window, or something made to look like one, showing the stars of Solus 7 from the station's outer ring. Sunvel noted that you could not see the shipyard from this angle. She did not think that was accidental. Osei poured tea herself. She offered it to Sunvel with the ease of someone who was not performing hospitality, but simply providing it. Then she sat down and folded her hands and waited. Sunvel made the case. Carefully, professionally, in the measured Keth diplomatic register she had used for 30 years. The Conclave recognized the disruptions. The Conclave was open to revisiting the terms of Earth status. There were mechanisms, she said, pathways. With good faith on all sides, a new framework for reintegration could. Osei reached to her left and placed a document on the table. She slid it across. It was a single-bound document, perhaps 80 pages. Clean cover, no title on the outside. The Conclave seal was not on it. Earth's administrative header was. Sunvel picked it up. She opened to the first page. At the top it said, Outstanding, Obligations, Reconciliation Accounting. Below that, a date range. 63 years. Below that, a number. Sunvel looked at the number for a long time. Orath Sen leaned forward slightly, and then stopped himself. His bioluminescence, against his training and his better judgment, flickered yellow. Sunvel looked up at Osei. Osei looked back at her with the expression of someone who is being perfectly polite and has nothing further to add. This is, Sunvel began. Itemized, Osei said. Every line. Supporting documentation in the appendix. We've cited the relevant Conclave commercial statutes for each category, the same ones used in the audit that provided the 31% cargo figure I mentioned in my final statement before the vote. You'll remember that figure. Sunvel remembered it. We're not asking for reintegration, Osei said. We're asking for what was owed. Those are different requests. Outside the window, the stars of solace, 7 were very still. Inside the room, no one spoke for a long time. The document had 83 pages. Sunvel read all of them on the transport back to Conclave space. She read them once for content, and once for structure, and once more slowly, taking notes, trying to find the place where the accounting became inflated, or the legal argument became wishful. She was a careful reader. She had been trained by people who were paid to find the holes in exactly this kind of document. She did not find any holes. The first category covered intellectual property, human-developed systems, algorithms, biological databases, and technical frameworks currently embedded in Conclave infrastructure, for which no licensing agreement had ever been executed. The humans had not, at the time, pressed for licensing fees. They had, however, kept records. Every system, every date of integration, every version update. 63 years of documentation, organized and cross-referenced with enough precision that it was clear this had not been assembled in the 3 months since the Exile vote. This had been built over years, probably decades, by people who had understood that a day like this might come and had decided that when it did, they would be ready. The second category covered labor. Specifically, the delta between standard Conclave compensation rates for skilled technical and medical work and the rates human workers had actually received a gap that existed because humans had been classified, for the entire 63 years of their membership, as associate tier contributors rather than founding tier, which meant they were subject to a different pay structure. A pay structure that saved the Conclave, over 63 years, an amount that was staggering when you saw it as a single total, rather than distributed across thousands of individual paychecks across decades. Interest had been applied at the standard Conclave commercial rate for unpaid obligations, which was, as Sunvel noted with something approaching dark admiration, a rate the Conclave itself had set, and which the humans were now using against it. There were smaller categories. Resettlement costs, administrative costs, the cost of establishing independent cartographic registration for Solace, 7, which the document noted had only been necessary because Conclave Stellar Registry was not available to non-members. The cost of constructing their own arbitration bureau, now operating out of Solace, 7, and already handling 14 active cases from non-Conclave parties, who had apparently decided that Earth jurisdiction arbitration was a perfectly acceptable alternative. The final category was the quiet one. It was called Ongoing Infrastructure Servicing Passive Use Without Agreement, and it covered every Conclave system that was still running, right now, on human-designed architecture that no one had replaced. The routing algorithm, the medical diagnostic indexes, the 17 relay stations, a dozen smaller systems that Sunvel had not even known had human origins until she read the relevant appendix page. Those systems were still technically the intellectual property of the human developers. The humans were not demanding they be shut down. They were not demanding immediate transfer. They were applying a standard licensing rate to continued Conclave use, retroactive to the date of Exile, and including a forward-looking schedule of monthly fees for as long as the Conclave continued to run the systems without an executed replacement agreement. The monthly fees were not ruinous. They were simply the kind of number that, when multiplied by 12 months, and then by 10 years, became a very significant long-term obligation. Suinvel presented the document to the council in a closed session. She put it on the table. She did not add commentary. She waited. The response was immediate and predictable. Sereth Ka called it extortion. He called it precisely that, using the Vorith word that implied not just financial coercion, but a particular kind of moral ugliness, a shakedown by a weaker party against a stronger one. Several other ambassadors agreed with him in varying degrees of volume. High Arbiter San did not agree or disagree. He read specific sections of the document. He asked Suinvel to confirm, twice, that the legal citations were accurate. She confirmed them both times. He went quiet. "This is unprecedented," said the Moor ambassador, which was true. "It is also," San said, "legal." The room went the kind of quiet that has texture to it. "They are using our own commercial law," San continued. He was not saying it with accusation or with admiration. He was saying it the way a navigator announces a heading, "This is the direction we are in, whether we intended to be here or not." The rates they have applied are standard Conclave commercial rates. The categories of claim are all recognized categories under the trade and contribution framework. The documentation, he paused, is thorough. "We could contest it," said the Keth trade minister. "On what grounds?" Suinvel asked. Silence. "The documentation," San said again quietly. 63 years of it. The negotiations that followed lasted 4 months. They were conducted on Solace, 7, at Osei's table, because the humans had no reason to travel to Conclave space for them, and the Conclave had every reason to come. Suinvel led the Conclave delegation. She was good at her work. She had been in difficult rooms before, and she was not rattled by a hard negotiation. But she found, over those 4 months, that there was a particular quality to negotiating with Yara Osei that she had not encountered before. It was not aggression. It was not coldness. Osei was professionally warm, consistently clear, and absolutely immovable on every point that she had decided was not negotiable. She did not bluster. She did not threaten. She simply knew what she wanted and waited, without apparent impatience, for the other side to figure out that they were going to give it to her. The intellectual property licensing was settled first. A structured buyout, phased over 8 years, at a rate the humans had proposed and the Conclave accepted after 2 weeks of counteroffers that Osei heard with full attention and declined with full courtesy. The labor differential was harder. The Conclave contested the calculation methodology. Osei's legal team produced a second methodology, and then a third, each arriving at a number within 2% of the original. The Conclave settled for a figure that was 81% of the original claim, paid over 12 years. Suinvel considered this a negotiating success. She also considered, privately, that she was not entirely sure it was. The infrastructure servicing fees stood, modified slightly in structure, locked in as a formal agreement with clear terms for the Conclave to develop replacement systems if it chose. No one in the room said what everyone in the room knew, that developing replacement systems for 63 years of embedded human architecture would take longer than anyone in the current council would hold their seats. What the Conclave did not get, through any of the 4 months, was Earth back. Suinvel raised it once, carefully, in the 9th week. A formal reinstatement proposal. Modified membership structure. A new framework that addressed the concerns that had led to the Exile vote, while providing. Osei listened to the whole proposal. Then she poured more tea. "We're not interested," she said, not unkindly. With the tone of someone declining a dinner invitation, they had already declined before and expected to decline again. "We appreciate the offer. The Conclave would benefit." "Yes," Osei said. "That's why you're offering." Suinvel stopped. "We're not in exile," Osei said. "The Conclave voted to remove us from a structure we helped build and maintain for 63 years. We accepted that vote. We left. We built something else." She set her cup down. "We don't need to go back. We need to be compensated fairly for what we contributed. Those are 2 very different things, and I'd encourage the council to understand the difference before the next session." The agreement was signed on the last day of the 4th month. Not all of it, the labor differential payments were structured as a separate instrument to be ratified by individual member species. But the core document, the licensing terms, the infrastructure fees, the establishment of an independent Earth Conclave trade lane outside the standard membership framework, because trade was still trade, and both parties needed it. The Conclave sent a formal announcement. Historic cooperative agreement. New framework for interstellar partnership. Language designed to make the thing sound like something it had not been. Ose sent nothing publicly. In her office on Solace, 7, looking out at the stars through a window that faced the shipyard, now its slow, steady construction, she did not need to hide. She reviewed the signed document one last time. The Conclave had not invited humanity back. Humanity had not asked to come back. What had happened instead was quieter and more permanent than either of those things. The Conclave had restructured its commercial law to formally recognize Earth as an independent partner entity. Its infrastructure agreements now carried human signatures. Its trade lanes ran through human-licensed corridors. Its disputes, increasingly, went to arbitration firms operating under Earth jurisdiction. The Conclave had not absorbed humanity. Humanity, without ceremony or declaration, without a single warship moved or a single threat issued, had made itself load-bearing again, just on its own terms this time. Ose closed the document file. She had a station to run. She had always had a great deal of work to do. The difference now was that everyone knew it.